Good morning. It's still morning. I feel like people have loved this side of the room this period more than the rest of the place. Alana, great job. Claire, Amy, and Sophie, great job. I wish there were more students. It is actually really nice. I did this at my own high school. I went to Fremd High School, graduated many years ago, and they have a Writers' Week. And they did all the students on a separate day, and I missed seeing that. And as a high school English teacher, it is like student writing that gets me most excited. I started writing when I was a sophomore in high school, and I never, ever could have imagined that I would have anything published ever, and then to have like a small book come out in October, and like my full length, the one on the right is coming out, like Mr. Schmidt said, in a couple of weeks. And I have a advanced copy here that still feels like I'm dreaming when I hold this in my hand. So I'm really excited to share poems with you, some of the stories behind the poems, and just get some questions as well from all of you. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me here. So I've been reading this, the opening poem in the book in the morning, but I'll give you a little bit of context. So my parents immigrated to the U.S. from Pakistan in the 1970s. And as I was growing up here, there was always, a lot of pride about where we were from, but there wasn't a lot of information about like what my ancestors or what the family stories were. And whenever we had to make family trees at school, we would get to my grandparents and maybe some of my great-grandparents, and then that was it. There was like no more information about who came before. And it was always strange to I'd get to school and I'd see some people had these generations and these trees that branched out and out. And ours always stopped at a certain point. And so I didn't always understand why that was. And I think it was the sense of like, well, those relatives are back in the motherland or they've passed on. And we knew them by a nickname, but not their real name. And so there were these silences, these gaps in my own family's history or my understanding of it. And as I was getting older, I realized that there was some of this was purposely not said. And that because of what my family had been through, a lot of people had been through, and I'll show some pictures and a little bit of a map in a little bit, that there was this purposeful not telling. And it was a sense of like, if we tell our children too much, it's going to be too painful. And if there's pain, that makes it hard to be hopeful. And we came to this country because we wanted hope. And it wasn't until much later on that I realized that there was a deliberate silence in many parts, and a lot of my poems are an attempt to fill those silences. And I lost my father about 3 years ago, and even when he was alive, he had been sick for a long time, and I remember thinking in my mind, I'm like, I don't have that much time left with him, and I knew even when he was alive, I'm going to wish that I had asked him more questions. But I still couldn't ask questions because I understood that some questions were just too painful. And I didn't want to reawaken pain that he had spent his life trying to push to the side, mainly to protect me and my siblings from having to deal with that pain. And so after he had passed on, I had been writing a lot about him and inventing memories, but this poem came to me about a year ago, and it's called The Opening, and it's the opening poem in the book. And I like to start with this because it frames a little bit of that struggle of how do you find out about your own family when they can't or they won't talk about it. And I imagine many of you can think of your own families and say, I wonder why this person is never talked about, or I wonder what happened at that moment in their lives. And this is it's an imaginary interview between a child and his father. And it's kind of like me talking to my dad, but it's bigger than that. The child. Tell me, Father, what new turbulence took hold in your blood on the day of my birth? And did your stomach sink each time I cried out for the basket of your arms? The father. I held you too close to feel anything but the wild gallop of your tiny heart. The child. Did you recite the call to prayer, slip your pinky dipped in honey into my mouth, to mark with song and sweetness my entry into the ummah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Father. All night I nursed a candle's flame, leaning in and out of its sphere of light, mumbling verses from the Quran, mispronouncing the Arabic and not understanding a word beyond Al-Fatiha, the opening, but knowing nonetheless I had fulfilled this first obligation of fatherhood. The child. What was it like to look into my eyes for the first time? The father. I felt as if my fingers were combing the embryonic silt, feathering the deepest bottom of the ocean. And when I resurfaced, holding the key to fatherhood, I understood the true worth of being a living thing. The child. What did you say to mother when she could not find the words to tell you about how the breaking open of a body propels one toward heaven, that God promises the greatest share of paradise to mothers? The father. After a long silence, I said, to every unutterable thing buried in your heart, to every miraculous truth teetering on the tip of your tongue, yes, yes, Amin. The child. Did you spill the blood of 2 goats, give their meat to the poor, to bless my arrival, to mark the transition of my soul from the library of the eternal into the living fire of a body too fragile to share? The father. For 20 years, I harvested the silhouette of my father's voice from the night sky. Let its echo rock me to sleep whenever I felt so crushed by heartache that even God's infinite love, a rescue vessel sailing through a history of bloodshed and loss, could not hold me intact enough to believe in survival. So if it was my hand or another's that guided the blade along 2 throats, I cannot recall, nor do I want to. The child. What else might you have done had fatherhood not stolen you from the life you knew? The father. When a surgeon saves your life by amputating a limb housing a reservoir of poison, you do not curse the violence of his work, nor the pain of the procedure. You bow down before God. You thank the man. You learn to write with the other hand, to walk on one leg. The child. One final question, Father. What should I say when my son, when one day I too have become a father, asks me about the hours of your life that exist beyond my knowing? The father. Tell him more about the hours of your life, so his hunger is not as desperate nor as bottomless as ours. So that ending about like tell him more about your life. So when I'm writing, I have a 3-year-old son now, and I often think about what about my life can he learn from my writing. And I think when I first started writing in high school, I really wasn't thinking that. I was just trying to get over my shyness and trying to find a voice. And I know a lot of you can relate to that, like trying to find a voice. And so, but as I got older and as I started asking questions about my own family history, I realized that there were, like I said, a lot of things were not spoken. Let me see if this is going to work like this. It's a little stuck right now. That's okay. If someone's able to get it to the next slide. There we go. Maybe. Go backwards. You get a history lesson as we move back in time. All right, so a little bit of some historical background. So, as Mr. Schmidt said, maybe some of you know about India and Pakistan or the history of it. Maybe you don't. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a backdrop in terms of history. So up until 1947, India was a colony of Great Britain, and really important colony. And then for decades and decades, nearly more than a century, the people of India were fighting for independence, very similar to the 13 colonies fighting for independence here. And finally, in August of 1947, India became independent. And as it became independent, it was split up into multiple countries. And the two countries, because these are the borders that my family is on, were India and Pakistan on the west, and then East Pakistan on the east side, and I'll show you that in a map in a second, became Bangladesh. So this is British India here. So that whole pinkish area is a country, includes Myanmar or Burma, all the way over there to Pakistan on this side. In 1947, in order to get independence, not in order to, but as part of the independence, there was a sense of let's cut this country up into a Muslim majority Pakistan, a Hindu majority India, and a Muslim majority East Pakistan, which in 71 became Bangladesh. So if you look at that right line on the Pakistan-India border, so my family was on the Indian side, and a lot of people, this is between 10 and 15 million people along that border, had to make a decision of do we stay in a country where we would be the minority, religious minority, or do we cross and become part of the majority? And so my family, both sides, my mom's side, dad's side, were on the Hindu-Indian side, and they moved over to the Muslim Pakistani side. So that's where that arrow is pointing is kind of where my family's roots are located. And what I didn't know is when I was your age or even younger was how traumatic and how bloody that migration was. So it's traumatic anyway. You're picking up all your stuff, and you don't have a lot of time. So it's the question I ask people is like if you got home and your parents or whoever your caretakers are said, okay, we have to leave, and we're crossing into Wisconsin, and we're never going to come back to Illinois. Get whatever you can together. We're leaving tonight, and what that would be like in terms of saying goodbye, in terms of staying in touch, and in terms of like items that I'm a really sentimental person. I love old photos and old objects. And so my mom, she was born after 1947, and she tells the story that it was there was so much tension, so much violence that people were murdering like neighbors and friends just it was so chaotic. And a friend of my grandfather's came to him at night and said, there's a group of people on their way to kill you and your family, so you need to go. And he gave my grandfather and the family some train tickets and said, you need to go now. So they basically grabbed what they could, crossed the border on a train, actually, which was trains. I'll show you a couple of pictures of trains. But during the migration on both sides, there was a lot of violence. And depending on which historical source you consult, it's either 1 million people died or up to 3 million people died. And these are people that relatively peacefully had been living together. And they became, almost overnight, independent, free, but at odds with one another, which if you're feeling pain and loss, and you also want to be hopeful about the future, what I realize is that people made the choice of saying we're going to ignore the pain, especially as we settle into our new lives, and then the next generation after that, we're going to pretend like everything was fine when it was not. So I wanted to share some pictures of the crossing. So most people, it's a pretty poor area of the world. Most people migrated on foot. And Time and Life magazine did this joint, they sent some photographers and journalists into India. And you can see it says 5 million Indians flee for their lives. That was the number at this time. The number doubled or tripled since this story. And people are carrying things on their heads, on their backs. And if you were exhausted or in bad health or elderly or young, people had to carry you. And there's a lot of migrations happening right now. There's a lot of images of migrants in Syria or the ones coming out of other parts of the world. It's very similar and really, really heartbreaking to see this happening now. And these are people whose lives had been normal, regular, everyday lives, and all of a sudden they're kind of thrown up for a loop. So you see this picture here. Some people, if you could afford to have, this is not wealth, but it's more than nothing to have some oxen and a cart, you could load up your stuff. You have no idea where you're going. You just know that you're going to end up in a place that has been abandoned. And my oldest aunt, my mom's oldest sister, her family home in Pakistan, it was owned by a Hindu family. They still, to this day, have the Hindu family's name above the door. And they have a little mandir, like a little temple to a god upstairs, and they've left it locked. And I remember asking them once, why didn't you change the name, or why keep the temple in the house? And they said, this is not our house. We've been here 60-some years. It's not our house. It's their house. It belongs to them. We're just keeping it. We're living here, but if ever they come back, it's their house. People don't go back. And so, again, the elderly being carried, and whatever you could to survive. And so, again, this is difficult on its own, but then if you have people fighting and killing each other, it becomes even more and more traumatic. And so these are some of the Life magazine photos. And so one of the photos, as I was doing research, this is the trains. The thing with the trains was that sometimes, if people on the opposite ends of the conflict would know a train is headed towards India or a train is headed towards Pakistan, and whatever, out of violent rage or who knows what was wrong with these people, they would basically get on the plane, on the train, kill everybody on the train, and then send the train to its destination. So these trains would arrive filled with corpses. Really, really vicious stuff. And there's been a lot of creative writers who've talked about it, but there's very little oral history and family history about this, again, because it's just too much. And so during my research, this is a photo that I found, and you might recognize it because it became the picture on my book cover. And so my publisher asked me, he said, a lot of these, not every poem, but a lot of these poems are about family and lost history. Do you have any photos of your family during partition? I said, there's nothing. They left everything. And they kind of realized that it was kind of a silly question to ask, do you have any photos? My dad, who was born in 1944, had no birth certificate. There's no marriage certificates. He had to kind of invent a birthday at some point. And so I show these pictures because the title comes from the idea of displacement. The book is like the displaced children of displaced children. And I don't know what it's like. But I do understand why my parents may not have wanted to talk a lot about this. My mom was born after. She talked more because she didn't go through it herself. And the thing with that picture is the only story my grandmother ever told me was that she carried my dad across the border. And so that picture of a woman carrying a child makes me imagine maybe this is not my grandmother, but almost my grandmother. So the next poem I want to read is it's a ghazal, and I'll tell you about the ghazal in a second, but the title of the book comes from this, and it's the second poem in the book. And so a ghazal, if you look at it's in couplets, so it's in two lines, and then the last word of each line is the same. So you'll see the word lost, and so much of identity gets lost, so much of history and memory gets lost. And then at the very end, if you're able to see at the bottom, in the last couplet, the poet will hold a mirror up to themselves and say, okay, so you've explored all these ideas, what does this mean to you? So what does this mean to me? It's a great form, really beautiful form, and if you ever want to challenge yourself, a ghazal is a great way to kind of force yourself into these lines and ideas. And so I'll read ghazal for the diaspora. And diaspora is a word that means, if you start looking at people that have scattered across the world, but they're all from the same place, the word for those people that are scattered is diaspora. So this is ghazal for the diaspora. We have always been the displaced children of displaced children. Oh, one thing I want to say. Then after this, my parents both immigrate to the U.S. and they got to start over, and there's displacement on top of that. And so I keep thinking about how often people move or have to move. We have always been the displaced children of displaced children, tethered by distant rivers to abandoned lands, our blood's history lost. To temper the grief, imagine your father's last breath as a Mughal garden. Marble pool at its center, the mirrored sky holding all his tribe had lost. Above the tussle of his wounded city, sad-eyed paper kites fight to stay aloft. One lucky child will be crowned the winner. Everyone else will have lost. Wish peace upon every stranger who arrives at your door, even the thief. For you never know when your last chance at redemption will be lost. In another version of the story, a steady loneliness mothers away the rust. Yet without windows in its hull, the time traveler's supplication gets lost. Against flame-lipped testimonies of exile's erasures, the swinging of an axe, felled banyan trees populate your nightmares, new enlightenments lost. The rim of this porcelain cup is chipped, so sip with practiced caution. Even a trace of blood will copper the flavor, the respite of tea now lost. Tell me, Faisal, with what new surrender can you evade deeper damnation? Whatever it is, hack away before your children too become the lost. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll read one more poem connected to South Asia. And this one's called Pakistan Fatherless, and it's the sense of if you are without a parent or without someone who can guide you and you're young, where would you end up versus if you had guidance? And it's a question I ask myself, having my parents guiding me, and it's been really important in my life. But not everyone has that, so how do you find your way? So this is basically the country, the founder of the country died within the first year. And after he died, there really wasn't a sense of who's going to take the leadership. It mentions in the fourth line Iqbal. Iqbal was this poet and philosopher, and a lot of his ideas were what set the foundation for Pakistan's identity. He's kind of like Thomas Jefferson in many ways. Pakistan Fatherless. Possibly it broke his heart when Jinnah divined as he recognized in half-sleep the angel of death kneeling at the foot of his bed, softly reciting Iqbal's Tarani-e-Hindi, that neither supplication nor streptomycin would save him, that his second child, the nation itself, would by nightfall become another orphan left to pine for her father, nursed not by his own hand, but its ineffectual shadow. Thank you. All right, so not every poem in the book is about, history, culture, nationality, memory. But there's a lot of poems about loss and about what it means to give something up or to lose someone or to just, feel grief. And so I've never had a dog, but there's actually 2 poems in here about dogs. How many of you have dogs? How many of you love your dogs, like maybe more than some people that you know in your life? Okay, so I don't think a single hand went down. So as someone who knows people with dogs, it was something, when I grew up, I was like, I couldn't understand how an animal could be loved so much. And as I've gotten older and I've gotten to know people with dogs better, I'm starting to get it. But without not being a dog owner, I really can't relate. But all of you can. And so if any of you lost a dog, what's that like? Horrible, terrible. Yeah, I mean, it's the grief, and there's something about the non-verbal communication between human and animal. I think that's what people have said, is that there's even a closer sense of connection because you don't talk, you just connect. There's this physicality of being in the same place. And so I have a friend at work who's a teacher as well. He lost one dog in the afternoon, and then his second dog died later on that day. So Stella died first, and then Lily died. And he said that the shock was really, really heartbreaking, but what was the real heartbreak sunk in when there was like nothing. Both of his kids have gone on to college. He said it was just absolutely silent in the house. You'd always hear them panting or their claws scraping against the floor or whatnot, or you would hear them bark. But without them there, it was like this haunting silence. And so I wrote this poem. I write a lot of poems as gifts. So this was a poem that I wrote for my friend Steve and Wendy, his wife. So this is remembering Stella and Lily, who died on the same day. So if you have a dog, you'll get this way more than I do, even though I wrote it. And if you've lost a dog, then you really understand it way more deeply than I can. And it's, for me, it's the imagination that I rely on a lot. It's been revised since I put this PowerPoint together, so you'll notice a few things. I'm going to add something, but a few things are a little different. But it's how writing is. Remembering Stella and Lily, who died on the same day. Solemnly, you recognized, when measured by human time, that the lives of dogs are much too short. So you take each little second and make it 7, and do so out of love. A love so vast, it needs more than a lifetime to claw loose the last layers of longing in a person's remembering. And so you love them deeply and purely, at times with an awe that transcends the reach of your own imagination. Nobody else, not even me, can understand the joys of this joy of these dogs who, when death came, entered its embrace together, leaving in their wake, like the rocketing light of the stars, iridescence that undoes darkness and melancholy, whose lingering presence, charged by the lives they lived, makes you feel they're still there, curled up at your feet, asleep. Thank you. So I'm going to read a poem. This is a gift I gave to Dr. Calentis. He was my principal, and he's still my good friend, but he was a principal at Highland Park before all of you got lucky and got him here. So, all right, upon waking. So this is, some of you are asleep. I can see it. I get it. It's poetry, but I love it. So this is a poem. If you're just waking up, this is a poem for you. If you've been awake, it's a poem for you to enjoy. And if you're a child, this is what it's like to think about childhood when you're no longer a child. So child, you're, I would say, less than the age of 25. And if you're older, it's a poem that might take you back to where all of you are right now. Upon waking. Toward the blazing blush of dawn, on this, another perfect day in March, move the wispy clouds like scarves, knowing nothing of weight. It's true, ordinary sights, seen with the right undulating touches of light, seem limitless and extraordinary, forever eavesdropping on wonder. So it is now, on this morning, that you can be tricked back into childhood's charm, eddying along its dissolving arc, so as to see once again the beauty of life. Thank you. And I was skipping through a couple of slides, partly because I wanted to show that. My favorite part about this poem is that it, if I can get it to go, it spells out someone's name there. So a lot of poems that I write are, is it anyone done an acrostic where you spell something out? So usually, when I was doing acrostics and learning how to write them, usually it was very obvious that I've written an acrostic, and it'd be, the first letter is terrific, and the second letter is outstanding, and then M would be for whatever. And then, so as I've been challenging myself to write more complex and layered poems, I'm like, I want to do acrostics, I want these to be gifts for people, but I want them to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more hidden. So this is what I did there. And then the poems that came before this, if I can get it to go back. So this is also, it spells out Stella and Lily's name, and so they're kind of, they're dead now, so they're kind of haunting, or their presence is still alive in the poem. And then this one here, if I can get there, this poem, it spells out the country's name itself. So it's a great challenge to kind of give yourself. So if you have someone in your life you want to give a birthday present to, or whatever, but to try to make it less than obvious. So I was going to read a few more poems, but before, maybe I won't, but if you have any questions, I can take them now. I can start taking them now. There have been so many great questions so far today. Yes? I was born in Elmhurst, Illinois, and I grew up in the south suburbs, and then I moved to the northwest suburbs. But yeah, the question was, where was I born? So, but I visited Pakistan, I think 7 or 8 times. Yes? Why did I change August to March? Because it's March, and it's a great day today. I'm here hanging out with all of you. So I wanted it to be more for all of us in the room right now than August. Dr. Clentus's birthday is in August, and so I wrote this as a birthday present for him. And so that's why it was August, but March for all of you. That's a good question, though. I do sometimes when I'm reading, we'll change things up a little bit to make it fit the moment, and sometimes I'll add things, and that's sometimes how I revise. I'll read something out loud, and I'm like, oh, this sounds better this way, so I'm going to change it. But yes, way in the back. How many poems have I written? That's a great question. So I started writing as a sophomore in high school, kind of very unseriously. So I think the number of poems, maybe in the thousands, but not everyone is finished. I'm writing all the time. I mean, I'm almost 40 right now. I was a sophomore 24 years ago. So if you think about how much writing, if you're writing all the time, of those, a much smaller number I finished, a much smaller number do I feel like these are decent or good. A way smaller number have been published. And then in this book itself, 42 poems are in there. The Dr. Clentus poem could not make it in, but I wanted to give it to him as a gift. But I'm hoping that I have a chance to write something new, and I'm always writing, and so there's always more to write. Other questions? Oh, way over there. Yes.
What was your least favorite class in high school?
My least favorite. Okay. So maybe it sounds like an answer I shouldn't give. I'm a teacher right now, and part of the reason I'm a teacher is I love being in a classroom. And so this is me being honest. There's not a single class I did not like. I was always like a science math person, and then English. English was probably my hardest class, the most challenging, but I still loved being in that class. And I know that might sound like it's just a teacher talking about how class is awesome, but I really have never had a class I didn't like very much. Yes, upstairs.
What is your favorite poem?
My favorite poem, that's such a great question. So there's a poet, it's actually, his quote is on the back of the Writers' Week t-shirts. Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, was a Turkish poet about 800 years ago. He has a poem called Moses and the Shepherd that I love. And it's a long poem, but it's this conversation about an incident that Moses, he kind of scolds this person that he sees on the street. And then like there's the voice of God comes in, and God and Moses have this conversation about how do you determine what the right way is. And the lesson is kind of like you can have multiple right ways to do something. There's not just one right path. So I love, love, love that poem. But there's so many. Yes? My favorite poem that I've written, I mean, there's a poem in here called Denaturalization, and it's actually like 14 pages long. I was talking to Mr. Schmidt about research and how that fits in. So the poem is, there was an immigrant from India in the 19-teens who became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1923, I believe, or 1922. And at some point, there was a ruling in the U.S. that said in order to be a citizen, you have to be white or you have to be black. Anyone in the middle, all Asiatics, you could not become a citizen. So he ends up losing his citizenship, and he's so distraught by that he ends up committing suicide. And so I'd read this person's story, and I said, I want to memorialize him in a poem. And so it's here. It's going to be published in a couple of months. And it's a really, really big, ambitious poem, so I'm really proud that I was able to write that. So that would be, yes, next to you. There's so many authors I look up to. I mean, we had a writer's week in my high school, and so this was like a really important experience for me when I was a young person. But I always have books of poetry with me. I'm reading poetry. There's so many people whose work I love. But I look up to a lot of people for that kind of guidance and support. Yes? You know, it varies. There are times where the question is how many hours a week do I write? I mean, I would say I put in a few hours every week at least. And I take the train to and from work. And so being on the train gives me time to write. When I'm really, really working, I'll do like 12, 16 hours in one sitting. I'll just get up early on a Saturday or Sunday, and I'll just write, sometimes even longer. And those are the very exhausting but really exhilarating days. I couldn't do that every day. But yes, in the...
Yeah, if you were going to choose one, if you had to choose one, would you write for the rest of your life or teach?
That's a great question. I've been asked that question. I think I would teach more than write. And the reason, I think being with people is way more important to me than, writing is very lonely at times. I don't think I could handle the loneliness of it. So I think the classroom, the social, the dynamic, the energy, even on days when it's difficult to be a teacher, I still would prefer that. But it would be hard to not write, though, to be honest. That's a great question to think about. Any other questions? Yes. Do I want to write poems for you? I would say that's something you should not give up the chance to do yourself. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.